Kawai Gillespie Gopan. Hello and welcome. My name is Audrey Arsenault and I go by the pronoun she, and I will be your host today. I'm a graduate student of the Advanced Studio Practice program at the New Brunswick College of Craft and Design. Thank you everyone for attending today, especially to our guest speaker, Danielle Hogan. A reminder before we begin that this session is being recorded, and so by staying and participating, you are consenting to being recorded. A gentle reminder that you can be seen and heard. Please, if you haven't done so already, turn off your microphones to mute to avoid feedback. And if you are experiencing glitching, turning off your video can help. The opinions given are strictly those of the speaker and do not necessarily reflect those of NBCCD, the ACC, or the Sheila Hugh Mackay Foundation. Lastly, I ask for your patience and understanding with the technology as we all navigate this delivery mode and change of pace. To officially begin, we are going over to Jean for the territorial acknowledgement.
Thanks, Audrey. So on this unceded and unsurrendered territory where we live and work and Zoom, the peace and friendship treaties were signed between 1725 and 1779 between the Ainu, the Wolastoqiyik, the Passamaquoddy First Nations, and the British. And these peace and friendship treaties were the very first of their kind to be signed between Indigenous nations and Western nations. And despite the efforts of the Canadian government since Confederation to assimilate and erase Indigenous peoples through acts and policies such as the Indian Act and the Residential Schools Act, thankfully the resilience of our Indigenous peoples means that their traditions continue to influence the Canadian political, cultural, social, and environmental landscape today.
Thank you, Jean. Now over to Lee to tell us about the guest lecture series.
Unmute. Sorry. The guest lecture series is sponsored and made possible by the Sheila Hugh Mackay Foundation, and it's organized by the Advanced Studio Practice program at the New Brunswick College of Craft and Design, in partnership with the Atlantic Center for Creativity. The purpose of the series is to model successful contemporary practice to our students and to inform, inspire, and ignite art and design dialogue and engagement in the greater public community. The guest lecture series provides this by giving a platform for presentation, creating time for dialogue, and by celebrating the creative and cultural riches that we hold in Atlantic Canada.
Thank you, Lee. Now over to Tracy to tell us about our partner, the ACC.
The Atlantic Center for Creativity is an initiative that promotes creativity across disciplines. It has three main goals. 1, promote research and programming in the area of creativity and innovation. 2, offer events such as symposia, conferences, and workshops on a yearly basis for sharing ideas and information. 3, build partnerships in the area of creativity and innovation on a local, regional, and national basis. You can get additional information and check out the new online journal, Creativity Matters, by visiting the website atlanticcenterforcreativity.com.
Thank you, Tracy. Now over to Amy for our guest speaker introduction.
Today's lecture by Danielle Hogan is titled Showing Up for Scraps. Inspired by different networks of care, in this talk, Danielle speaks to the repercussions, both positive and negative, of effect and how considered in relation to textiles in the contemporary art, the effect often leads to a particular assessment of value, which she terms femme-effect. Danielle Hogan, PhD, is an interdisciplinary artist, writer, curator, and practice-informed researcher. Currently, she is responsible for New Brunswick's provincial art collection, Collection Art NB. Over to you, Danielle.
Great, thanks, Amy. I appreciate that. I'm going to actually stop my video. I just want to tell everyone because I'm going to share my screen, and you don't need to see the side of my head. I have a computer over here that I'm going to read my notes from. So I'm going to do that. You're going to see me disappear. And all right. So hi, everyone. As I begin here, I want to thank you very much. I want to say thank you very much to the New Brunswick College of Craft and Design community for inviting me to be here with you today on this unceded Indigenous territory. I want to note that I'm presenting this lecture today in my capacity as an independent artist and academic. It's also critical that I acknowledge and express my deepest gratitude for all the support I receive and the contributions made to my thinking, made by not only the artists featured in this talk, but also importantly, the interwoven line of unnamed educators, my family, friends, colleagues, historians, and thinkers, traditionally and non-traditionally speaking, whose contributions to their practices and communities have collectively made it such that I am able to be here with you all today. Okay, and so with that, I'd like to start my talk, Showing Up for Scraps.
She's also setting her up. She's busting her up with elbows, and she's going to switch. And she's softening her up from this position. She's looking for that left arm of Misha Tate. Now, it is worthy of note, Misha, the only fighter to overcome 3 knockdowns in a fight and come back to win. She's setting up the triangle. She's setting up the triangle. She doesn't quite have it locked up. She's on the elbows, but man, Misha's busted up. And she keeps pushing that arm across the face. Now Misha's got to get out of it.
Misha Tate was a scrappy UFC fighter. Her 2013 UFC fight against Ronda Rousey was a fierce exchange from the opening bout. After multiple workarounds during their scrap, Tate finally went down in the 3rd round. But this match was the first time Rowdy Rousey had ever had to go any more than seconds in a UFC match, let alone 2 full rounds in her 12-0 career. But I'm not going to talk to you today about fighting, at least not the UFC sort. What I did show up to talk with you about today is the concept of scrappy and what a scrappy methodology can look like in a practice of art. Another way of saying it might be to explain that I'm referring to scrapping as a metaphor, not a fist fight. A synonym for the word scrapper is bricoleur, taken from the French, and it can be translated to do it yourself or doing what you can with what you've got. Actually, literally collaging from scraps. For my PhD research, I made use of bricolage methodology, and the title of my dissertation, Just Making It, like the title of this talk, is a double entendre. That is to say, it's a particular way of wording something, which is designed to have a double meaning. One that is generally obvious, whereas the second often conveys a message that is intentional, but less obvious. So back to UFC fighter Misha Tate, how her match against Rowdy Ronda Rousey applies to my talk is not for being a fighter literally, but rather for the example of her feisty methodology. She is known as someone that's always looking for the workaround, someone who's repeatedly creating openings and making space, and that within the broad ring of community, citizenship, and collectivity in the visual arts is precisely the scrappy methodology that I'm talking about today. My own studio practice guided research is qualitative rather than quantitative. It focuses on details rather than generalizations, and numbers rather than generalizations in numbers. I've made this simplified scrap quilt to just briefly demonstrate the basic relationship between research methodologies in my work in hopes of contextualizing the different scraps of art projects that I'm going to show you. It doesn't want to go forward from here. Hang on one sec, everybody. This is the technology blip that I told you would inevitably come. Hang on.
What about the play button, Danielle, at the top, on the top bar?
Gonna have a look here one sec. Sorry, everyone. Stop. Here we go. And I'm going to play from here and go back to sharing. A sec. Okay, and we're back to where we need to be. Thanks, everybody. Sorry.
Okay.
So this is the very next slide after the scraps of my quilt research. And we should be good from here because none of the other slides have animated pieces. Okay, so British artist Jenny Saville is known for her depictions of the body. She has spent her career creating images which challenge society's pressures to conform to a standard and has featured obese, trans, young, old, beaten, and even dead bodies in her paintings. Others have written extensively about how Saville's non-conventional perspectives on beauty expands the traditional art historical nude form into a way to comment on the body, gender politics, sexuality, and self-realization. Saville herself has said that she is most interested in how bodies can change and what causes those changes. For my money, Saville's dogged determination to feature all bodies, free of direct commentary or judgment, is a scrappy approach to take up, challenging that which society takes for granted as, quote, standard, constructing images that literally and metaphorically dominate the perceptions and prejudices that we bring to them. I'm suggesting to you that scrappy is everything on the table, not just the leavings. This is a painting called The Gleaners by artist François Millet. The practice of collecting the last scraps of wheat harvest, as depicted in this composition, also known as gleaning, was traditionally part of the natural cycle of the agricultural calendar undertaken by the poor in France. However, this composition by Millet, like Jenny Saville's compositions featuring obese women, caused a real stir because it turned the dominant upper classes monopolizing narrative on its head. The artist depicted these three poor, lower class women as large in scale and at the center of this painting. 84 by 112 centimeters. This was a large painting depicting labor at the time. This size of a canvas was generally reserved for religious or mythological style paintings at the time. The Gleaners was seen by upper class visitors to the Paris Salon in 1857 as an unwelcome reminder from Millet of the peasant revolt that overthrew the upper class in 1789, known to us as the French Revolution. Baratunde Thurston, American activist, comedian, and author of the New York Times best-selling book, How to Be Black, is no stranger to talk about revolution. As a matter of fact, he is currently the executive producer and host of 2 podcasts, one of which is called We're Having a Moment, for which his webpage reads, when Mitt Romney joins a Black Lives Matter march and NASCAR bans the Confederate flag, when major cities actually contemplate defunding the police, and when Adidas retweets Nike in support of Black Lives Matter, something big's going on. However, it's Baratunde's other podcast, How to Citizen, that I am currently binge listening to. The show reimagines the word citizen into a verb, and it reminds us how to wield our collective power. It is powerful because it focuses on the positive. Thurston looks at how we can fight for a society that we're proud of. Each episode of How to Citizen, with title subjects such as Democracy Means People Power, Literally, featuring Citizen University founder Eric Liu, and the title Fight COVID with Everyone and Everything You Know, features interviews with doers, from scientists to community activists to artists. Repeatedly, Baratunde informs listeners of ways that they can do a powerful job of showing up for themselves and for others. It offers listeners suggestions of things that they can do literally. Therefore, I'm suggesting that Baratunde Thurston is a bricoleur, making use of all the skills that he has on hand as a writer, activist, comedian to create positive change. And that's a scrappy citizen. Oh, guys, we're having the same. I don't know why my screen is not moving forward for you and me. Hang on, we're going to pause. Oh, you see me now? Can you see this?
Not yet, no. You might need to refresh or just press share screen again.
Okay, a sec, because it came up on my screen.
There we go, Danielle. Now we see it.
Okay. I apologize, everyone. Thank you for sticking with me through my tech troubles. Okay, so from How to Citizen. In the episode Building Bridges, Not Walls, with artist Tanika Johnson, Baratunde shares about her folded map project, describing the project as one that encourages citizens from disparate ends of Chicago, geographically and economically, to get to know one another. This is a powerful example of art practice-led citizening. The Gee's Bend quilting tradition is recorded as dating back to the 19th century, with the earliest known quilts from the 1920s and 30s. Historically, the women pieced their quilts together from discarded clothing, salvaged work clothes, or found fabric scraps, such as feed sacks, out of pragmatic need to keep their families warm in unheated houses, and created what are commonly known to us now as scrap quilts, when in fact, the creativity, skill, and design sense required to execute these pieces is anything but leftover, and rather scrappy, as in regenerative. The textile historian Amelia Peck has importantly questioned the larger art world's positioning of Gee's Bend's quilts in relation to abstract artworks. She cites the New York Times rave review of the quilt's Whitney show in 2002, where art critic Michael Kimmelman wrote, "Imagine Henri Matisse and Paul Klee arising from rarefied Europe, but arising not from rarefied Europe, but rather from the caramel soil of the rural South in the form of women, descendants of slaves, when Gee's Bend was a plantation." Peck argued that this kind of review created an image of the works that amounted to, and I quote, something like a party trick. That is, quote, "Isn't it amazing that these untutored rural women were able to make something almost as good as our favorite paintings of the late 20th century? Author Alex Ronan, in her 2018 article, Master Quilters of Gee's Bend, stitching together questions of race, art, and commerce through a quilting tradition born in slavery, wrote, and I quote here her, "The quilt's value, in that case," being the quote I just read to you previously, "comes when they are only degendered, transitioning from feminine craft to masculine art, and de-raciated, or more specifically, when the race and geographic origin of the creator serves only to suggest how unlikely it is that they'd create such pieces. Now, unlikely may just have been what my grade school teachers would have thought about my ever taking on doctoral research. And yet, here I'm briefly introducing you to what, in the context of my talk this afternoon, I'm going to call my scrappy PhD argument, just making it, the stain of femme-effect on fiber in art. The problem I investigated in my doctoral research and art practice is how fiber, central to most textile-based craft skills, though not all of them, represents an ephemeral and sticky concern for intersectional theorists and feminist academics dedicated to challenging instances of sexist and heteronormative and patriarchal bias in art. For women, non-binary, queer, fluid people, Black, Indigenous, people of color, and other members of the LGBTQ2+ communities, a studio practice exclusively featuring textile material presents a real challenge to that artist's ability to just make it in art world today. One of the praxis elements of my research involved creating this, an online art gallery, or I should say, these are examples from it, which in 2015, and this is already hard to remember given that since the emergence of COVID-19, seemingly everything has gone virtual, but my online gallery was a tough idea to sell in 2015. At its center was community. It was about speaking out about artists whose work that I believed was undervalued was seen, heard, and made space for. To borrow from Baratunde Thurston, the GAG, for short, what was actually called, the long name was Gynocratic Art Gallery, was about citizening, about valuing the collective. It was about showing up, choosing to participate, and investing in relationships. Now this piece was knitted by American-born Australian artist Kate Just. Just was the first artist featured on the GAG gallery. Her knitted series, Feminist Fan, is made up of over 40 portraits, 40 knit portraits, which is over 10,000 stitches and 80 hours of work. Just wrote, in part, the following about this image of Canadian artist Peaches. And here I quote Just. My Feminist Fan series has mainly featured visual artists using textiles and adornment to challenge restrictions about female, queer, or trans embodiment, race, and artistic agency. Though Peaches is a musician, this ex-school teacher also resonates strongly with me as an artist whose use of costuming and clothing carries a mighty fistful of attitude. Amy Mesner is a textile artist from Alaska who's no stranger to scraps of other people's clothing. Of her multi-year project, Inheritance, she literally stitched together from donated scraps. Amy Mesner writes, these salvaged embroideries, linens, and crocheted items embody the original maker's intention for beauty, home, and possibility. Cutting such material apart and reconfiguring it for a contemporary context meant sifting through the tangible and intangible detritus of women's lives. Despite conflicted emotions around inherited objects, inherited ideals, and inherited perceptions, we continue this potent ritual of insisting that what we create has value, even if useless, unwanted, outdated, even if it's conjured from scraps of a life. And this is one of the finished quilts that Amy Mesner created from the pieces of fabric and embroidery that were mailed to her, left to her, donated to her, gifted to her as part of the Inheritance Project. And it's called Mater Familias. Now, it'd be difficult to underestimate Canadian artist and academic Alison Mitchell's contribution to queer feminist theory, art, and personally to my own creative practice. I may just have read every scrap of paper, I swear, that this woman has ever written on. Mitchell and her work are uniquely positioned within the fields of art and academia and feminist academia for the way in which she deftly takes on these roles with equal success. Feminist Art Gallery, or FAG, queer reference intended, Mitchell was part of an amazing group of performers, citizens, artists, people. She was part of the performance group Pretty Porky and Pissed Off. And in addition to being a celebrated queer theorist for coining the term deep les, as a philosopher, Mitchell offers a form of map or recipe from scraps with deep les, a bricolage with the opportunity to empower society to suture wounds, to suture together the scraps. Deep les suggests the creation of an altogether different and open pattern of behavior. Therefore, I'm going to quote Mitchell now. And these are crocheted pieces that she exhibited at the Tate Modern Gallery in London, England, when she was there for to present at a conference at the Tate Modern and also host a workshop called Axe Grinding. She writes about deep les. Deep les is meant to be a macrameed conceptual tangle for people to work through how they integrate art into their politics and how they live their lives and continue to get fired up about ideas. Deep les can offer alternative ways of imagining the world and who we are. It is meant to be passed hand to hand from crafter to filmmaker to academic to students to teachers to leaders and back again. My wish is that it permeates and also loosens things up. Deep les is the volunteer, the workshop coordinator, the curator, the consumer, the first initiated, and the instigator. Anyone who gets intrigued by this bell-bottom, fat-assed catch-all, end quote. What I think I appreciate most about Alison Mitchell's work is that, much like Baratunde Thurston's, it is inclusive and caring and funny. It's a trinity of adjectives not regularly found, yet I'd argue much needed within academia today. It's also collective. And today that means showing up. And today I want to say that that's scrappy. Teeny Pricks is a public art project created and curated, bricolaged together by Canadian-American artist Diana Weimar. Weimar describes the Teeny Pricks community as, quote, contributors from around the world stitching Donald Trump's words into textiles, creating the material record of his presidency and of the movement against it. Teeny Prick Project holds a creative space in a tumultuous political climate. This series will go strong until Trump is out of office, end quote. Weimar has vowed to continue to hold...
Just a sec. Okay, I found this on the web.
Siri thinks I was talking to her.
I'm sorry. I can't complete your request.
This series will go strong. Weimar has vowed to continue to hold this space for citizens, to send their embroideries, to continue to create opportunities for these visual expressions of frustration, anger, and sadness to be heard and to be seen, to continue to fight with this president until he has been literally and metaphorically knocked out of the White House. In addition to the fantastic verbal scrapping that academic and activist Sarah Ahmed has done at her blog Feminist Killjoy and in her many publications, she writes in her book Living a Feminist Life how feminists create inventive solutions, such as forming support systems, systems of care to survive the shattering experiences of repeatedly facing the walls of racism and sexism. Weimar's project, Teeny Pricks, has created an opening for fiber artists and everyone else willing, frustrated, and angry enough to pick up a needle and thread to use their particulars, the uniqueness and eccentricity of their own marks for intersectional feminist contributors of all sexes and gender expressions, to speak back to the current torrent of racism and sexism being unleashed by the White House. Another project that speaks back to the nation, in this case Canada, is Coast Salish artist Carrie Newman's piece Witness Blanket. At a 2012 hearing of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, Newman heard his father share his painful experience at a residential school. Hearing his father's story changed the artist's life forever. He set out to create a monument to recognize the atrocities of the residential school era and honor the children who were affected. Inspired by a woven blanket, Newman created a large art installation, bricolaged, from hundreds of items reclaimed from residential schools, churches, government buildings, friendship centers, band offices, treatment centers, and universities across Canada. The structure's fragments represent fragmented cultures, crumbling buildings, segments of language, and diminished pride. Connected by the common experience that created them. The structure will recount for future generations the story of loss. The stories of loss, strength, reconciliation, and pride. Newman's 2-meter by 13-meter witness blanket has been seen by more than 100,000 people in Canada so far. Now, notions of resilience that have existed for millennia in Indigenous culture and are beginning to surface in academia today require a systematic rethinking to address the distinctive cultures, geographic and social settings, and histories of adversity of Indigenous people. Authors of the article Rethinking Resilience from Indigenous Perspectives write, and I quote, "In Canada, the overriding social realities of Indigenous people include their historical rootedness in a specific place with traditional lands, communities, and transactions with the environment, and the profound displacement caused by colonialization," end quote. Therefore, for this reason and many more, it is critical to note that projects such as the Witness Blanket be ones that are led by Indigenous people and center Indigenous people. These examples are evidence of how art can be a vehicle for showing up. Like the UFC fighter Miesha Tate, sometimes scrapping is finding a workaround or a new perspective, as Francois Millet did with the Gleaners. Sometimes it's making space like Alison Mitchell did in her work with the FAG, or Baratunde Thurston as he encourages people to citizen, as Diana Weimar is doing with Teeny Pricks until November 3rd US election, and as Coast Salish artist Carrie Newman's work does, as it reminds us to witness, and even perhaps be willing to pick up the pieces. In each case, we're being called by artists who value the collective and the communal to show up. I have 2 slides left. I'm going to keep going and I'm going to leave this one up because the last image is an image of the Women's March. And I think that we've all seen it enough that you can just imagine an image with a large crowd of people. To actively citizen is to choose to be part of the collective. And today we live in a culture of the individual, of the single creative genius, the cult of personality. So to choose to show up for the collective is radical. Choosing to create, to creatively engage in systems of care is scrappy. This presentation has been a form of advocation, a centering of creative systems of care, a creative call for more scrapping, more bricolage, because as we've seen today, scraps are the legacy, the odds and the ends, the remnants, the teacher and the lesson. Scrappy is the debris and the surplus. It is the leftover and the survivor. Above all, it's a mindset. To be scrappy is to be the one always looking for the workaround. Scrappy is standing up, even though you may not always be the last one standing. Scrappy is showing up again. Finally, I want to note that this presentation by no means represents an exhaustive list of artists who are holding space, showing up, caring, and being scrappy by citizening. There are many I've left out for reasons of time, and many more for my ignorance of them. I encourage you all, whether you're working in textiles, ceramics, metals, design, comedy, or citizenship, to seek out these scrappers and to think about using your own practice in ways that hold space, care, and consider the collective. Thank you. Merci. Walalan, waliwen. Jean, I'm going to turn it over to you and get back to my video because I'm frozen here.
Excellent. Thank you, Danielle. So I'm going to thank you so much for sharing your talk. That was wonderful. And thank you for persisting with the technology. You're not the first it's happened to. The last. So I'm going to.
I bet you're the first that Siri spoke to, though, in the middle of her talk. I don't know why all of a sudden the phone, because I was timing myself, thought that it needed to talk to me. Yeah. But anyway.
It's wonderful. So I'm just going to I pass it out to you folks, to the audience. If you have any comments or any questions for Danielle, you can voice them, or if you wish, you can type them in the little participant, the chat window, and we can capture them there. And know that even if your question or comment doesn't get read, I pass those text files to the speakers so that nothing is missed. If there was something that you wanted to mention, it will still go, and Danielle will get those comments whether they're read or not. So yeah, you can just type them right in.
I loved when Casey said last week that she was comfortable with silence because she was a teacher. So
that's right. Yeah. Yeah. So Jacqueline says, thank you, Danielle, for sharing. It was awesome. And I'm super excited to find this podcast, How to Citizen, Baratunda. Yeah. So that will be one I'll be checking out. Yeah.
I can't recommend it more highly. And also the other podcast, We're Having a Moment, they're incredibly powerful. And the speakers that Baratunde and the others who are working with him bring on to participate, to comment, to share in his podcast are amazing. And I think one of the really interesting things about the podcast, as I mentioned in my talk, is the fact that the speakers and the host aren't only telling us things, they're showing us how to actually show up and citizen. So if you go to the website that's attached to the podcast, they write out what in the spirit of what was discussed in that podcast, what you could do either just yourself, like personal work, to things to think about, things to explore. And then if you'd like to go out into the community to further explore the subjects from the podcast, there are suggestions there too. And talking about the project, or when they were discussing the Folded Maps project, some of those things, to give an example, were as simple as like the work you could do, the quiet work you could do yourself, were suggestions to think about things you love, think about things that matter to you, and what makes them special where you live and in the community that you're from. And then think about another community you don't often travel to, or maybe somewhere that you've heard is bad or scary, and look up similar places there. Start following them on Instagram. See if there's maybe somewhere where they've done some Facebook Live that you can listen to them And that work of crossing the divide, of finding something that you're already interested in, and then seeing how someone that you know very little about is enjoying that same thing. That's an example of one of the things that they outline specifically in that podcast when it comes to learning how to citizen better. I love that they use it as a verb. Yeah.
Wonderful. I think artists, you know, do that anyway in many of them in their role. I know in thinking that these are also, they're very contemporary, very poignant and very kind of current ideas. And in placing myself back as a student, I often wasn't even self-aware of who I was and what the ideas should have been in my work. And so it was difficult at that time for me to be able to reach out and to look outwards at what was happening in the world, or to know as an artist how I could have any kind of impact. And so what I like about all of the examples you have shown is that, yes, it's about the doing. It's about also how you do something and how you can act as a conduit, and you can gather community, or the simple act of making your work is creating impact, is a decolonizing act, is an act of generating community and safe space and a place of belonging. And it's just, there were wonderful examples. The comments are coming in now. Lee says, I'm particularly interested in your observation about the Geese Bend quilts being ascribed value by being degendered and deraced.
Thanks for the question, Lee. Do you know what that's, so the Geese Bend quilts, like I'll just let you a little bit in my head for a quick second about even talking about them within this talk. They were a huge part, both research-wise and inspiration-wise, to my dissertation research. And so I'm sitting here right now still not knowing if I did any kind of justice to how I presented it in this talk, because there's so much there. And specifically issues around gender and race with Gee's Bend as an area, as a place in Alabama, with the time in which those works were discovered. There was an American researcher who was traveling around the States and visited there and bought some of the quilts, and that sort of first launched them somewhat into the public sphere. It was around the time of the riots or the marches in Selma, Alabama, and so all of that, the importance of that, and scary as it is, its strong relationship to what's happening in our world today. That, on top of all the issues of gender, which get into the specific findings of my PhD research, which was taking the notion of woman, the irreducible fact of woman, and how it is conflated with our impressions of gender. So our impressions of a woman and what makes a woman, and how those have been erroneously mixed up with feminine, because feminine is a quality that all genders make use of. And so taking that femme from femme affect in my research, and then affect, which is an effect with the E, is I hit my head, and the effect is I get a bump. An affect is that feeling that sticks to me when something happens, or I see something and I can't quite put my finger on what it is or why it's there and why I can't shake it, but it is real. It is an affect of having seen or experienced something. And so in my research, and specifically, I learned a lot from researching the G's Bend quilts, this idea of putting together femme, or the feminine, and affect, and making the word femme affect, and then how it is not inherently a negative word or a negative affect, but in our culture today, patriarchal, heteronormative, culture that we live in, it is currently a negative affect, which the effect, the result of that, is decreased value when it comes to that work being collected by museums and galleries and things like that. And so I hope I haven't kind of given some really kind of jargony talk back to you, Lee, because your question is like the center of everything I spent 5 years looking at and looking into. And I'm still struggling today to find ways to articulate what is not uber smart, but ephemeral, like just hard for me to get my hands on, and then be able to share it in a way that I can connect with people about and that they can relate to. So thank you for the question. If you'd like to talk about that more, I'd offline, I'd love to.
Thanks, Danielle. Both Tracy and Joe have mentioned how they're very grateful that you've got this wonderful, empowering voice, and they loved listening to you. And they're both definitely going to tune into the podcast. So, and Karen asked what the second one was called. I don't know if that question came before, but it's We Are Having a Moment. Is that correct, Danielle? Yeah.
It is. Absolutely. Thanks, Jean.
Okay.
Good student.
Notes. Yeah. And John, you had a longer comment. Do you want to voice that maybe?
Well, possibly. Anyway, Danielle, great talk, by the way. My interest in architecture. Coincidentally, I'll have to share a book with you, and it's in Alabama. It'd be basically in the same region as G's Bend, but there's an architecture studio out of Auburn University, founded about 30 years ago, called Rural Studio. And a group of students, they take basically castaway scraps and building materials, and they go out in Hants County, which is the poorest county in America, and they do basically buildings for the community and individuals made out of things like carpet tiles, castaway tires, car windshields. Wow. And they do these incredible works of architecture, exactly what you're talking about. For generally, it's poor Black county in Alabama, but it's a 20th and 21st century version of that through architecture, and you'd be really interested in it, so I can share that with you. But it's the same sensibilities.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. Yeah, another part, and I was just really conscious of not wanting to go over time with my talk today, but another part of that history of the quilters and the social justice and race advocates and activists in that area of the United States. One of the things that was recorded during that time that I wanted to touch on has to do with this idea of finding the workaround. And one of the things that appeared in one of the papers about G's Bend and what happened to it, because some of those quilters chose to participate in the marches in over the 5 days from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama. And I hope I'm not getting this wrong, I think it was the police chief, but it may have been the mayor, was quoted as, so they lost their ferry that helped them get from G's Bend out to the larger community and join the main access route to Selma and kind of the rest of the larger communities that helped them be present, and to participate in the political movements of the time, and also to get their work out, their quilts, their also their harvests. So again, either the police chief or the mayor is quoted as saying, we didn't take away their ferry because they're Black. We took away their ferry because they forgot they were Black. And so for me, what I take away from that is that idea of people who are unwilling to sit down. And so what they literally did was they found the workaround. They didn't stop going to Selma. They drove the long way. and made every trip that they had intended to make. So, I mean, if that isn't a workaround, I don't know a story of artists who've ever found one. So yeah, I'd love to see that book. Thanks, John. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Danielle. You mentioned the idea of bricolage too, and there was a quote that came to me from Arthur Ashe, and Arthur Ashe was a champion, like a world-class black tennis player, and he was also a wonderful advocate for AIDS and raised much awareness and money for that. And anyway, you know, his and I think, I don't know if I'm quoting him right, but he said, start where you are, use what you have, and do what you can. And I think that, you know, when, as artists or young designers, or, you know, at any point in life, about any problem we face, sometimes it can be overwhelming when we see the sheer magnitude of the problem and the pervasiveness and, you know, systemic racism. Like, as an individual, where do we begin? Where do we start? As an artist, how do we even insert ourselves there to do good? But I think it's those tiny little daily tasks. It's the micro wins. It's the, like you mentioned, showing up. But I often go to that quote by Arthur Ashe, which itself is a bricolage philosophy, right? Just take what's there and run with it. Because then, whether we feel deprived or less than, or in a space where we don't have power, we have something. And so we can begin, and it puts us into a place of doing, which is more powerful.
Yeah. You know, the idea, something that I'll just share about Diana Waymar's work and the Teeny Pricks project. Diana is a good friend of mine. She was a student of mine at the Vancouver Island School of Art when I was teaching there, in a course that I designed called Art in the Language of Craft. And I remember her saying, and Jean, this kind of relates a little bit to our conversations earlier about, you know, keeping all the balls in the air and juggling. I remember Diana was in my class, and you know, I had constructed this curriculum around all these artists who inspired me and this work I loved that was all textile based. And I remember Diana coming to me one day and said, you know, when I married my husband, I inherited all of these vintage linens. And, you know, she said, the responsibility of what to do with them. She's like, they aren't even my stories necessarily that are attached to them. And I feel responsible to them, but I don't necessarily know yet, you know, what they need to be. And, you know, it's been a real, humbling experience to watch Diana over the last number of years, you know, progress into an artist that has far exceeded my reach, you know, with her work with Teeny Pricks, and, you know, find ways to incorporate textiles and the meanings, both literal and metaphorical, that come with that work and the traditions attached to it. And then make space for it in today's culture, and have a voice to contribute something valuable, and a record that is tangible of what's happening in American politics today. So I always think of Diana when I think of those moments that I like to hope, or I like to assume we all have, where you think, how am I going to put all this together? You know, what do I do with all these things I am and have? You know, how am I ever going to make sense of this in a way that serves others? And, you know, my God, I can't imagine, you know, thinking about what she's done with Teeny Pricks. She certainly managed.
And I guess that's another aspect of bricolage, the DIY, is that you're never actually done. We don't finish.
Yep.
We
I like that. Yeah.
We pause for a moment and we move to something else. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
For those who have video turned off too, if anybody would like to type in a comment or a question, we still have about 4 minutes left.
Hi, Danielle. Thank you so much for your talk. It was super interesting.
Oh, thank you for listening. I want to say, I know as both a teacher and as a student, that there's often things that people think about after the talk is over, after the cameras get shut off. And then also some of us that just really don't feel comfortable asking questions, even in typed form, in this kind of a public way. So it would be an absolute privilege to have a conversation with any of you if you'd like to after the fact, or you can feel free to email me. I'm rather easy to find online, and I'd be happy to continue conversations. And also, actually, importantly, I'd really like to hear about what other people are doing and hear about other people's work. This is one thing actually that I know when Jean, you invited me initially to speak to the advanced studies class, there was going to be a crit portion at the end. So after lunch hour, we were going to move on to the actual class time with the students.
Yeah.
And I was really looking forward to that opportunity to actually, you listened to me, and I was looking forward to the opportunity to listen to you. So I just want to say that I'm sorry that we're in the middle of a global pandemic. Not that I've been in any way responsible for that, but I do just want to recognize that the part of the bargain where you listened to me has happened, and the part of the bargain that I was looking forward to, which was an opportunity to hear from you, I do not have the opportunity to do because of COVID-19. So I really do welcome any of you to share your practice with me, so that I can learn from you too.
Thank you, Danielle. You gave a fantastic talk. I know there's lots of thank yous coming in now from Karen Rouet, from Tracy O'Brien, from Lee McLean, Myrna Gunter. She said she listened to you very intently. They're all saying thank you for your generous offer and for your talk today. And I'm cognizant that we have 1 minute left. And so I'm going to say thank you again, Danielle Hogan, and ask Audrey if she's still there, if she'd like to tell us about next week's speaker.
Thanks everyone for attending again, and a reminder that next week's talk on October 22nd is Gillian Dykeman. Willoughby, thank you.
Great.
Thank you, Audrey. Okay. So I guess members of the public, it's adios for now, and those who are in class with us can remain online. Thanks for joining us, and see you all again next week.